Four letters carved into the bones of an empire. You've seen them on crumbling ruins, ancient coins, even Hollywood's idea of Roman glory. But what if I told you that this symbol supposedly representing the Roman people was never really about them at all? It was a mask, a weapon, a carefully crafted illusion used by Rome's elite to justify expansion, silence rebellion, and crown power with the illusion of democracy. Because behind the grandeur of marble and marching legions, Rome's greatest empire wasn't just built with swords. It was built with symbols, and SPQR was the sharpest of them all. Welcome to Shadows of Ancient History, and today we're peeling back the golden veneer to expose the dark secrets behind Rome's most enduring lie. But here's where it gets disturbing. The phrase Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the Roman people, was stamped on standards, temples, proclamations, even sewer grates. It created the illusion that the Roman people had power, voice, dignity, that Rome was a shared project, a republic, a beacon of law and order. In truth, it was psychological warfare, an early form of mass propaganda. While the average Roman citizen waited in line for grain, the Senate passed secret deals. While consuls gave speeches about liberty, slaves built their villas. And while the people bled in foreign wars, the elites carved more initials into stone SPQR, 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 until it no longer meant anything. Until it became branding, not belief. And here's the twist. Most history classes skip. The Republic didn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It rotted quietly from the inside out while still wearing the mask of democracy. The people still voted, the Senate still met, the temples still rang with praise for Rome. But underneath it all, the system was rigged. Elections were controlled by aristocratic families. Laws were written in ways no one understood. Public debates became rehearsed performances for the mob. And what replaced it? A string of charismatic strongmen, Julius Caesar, Augustus Nero, who promised to save the Republic and buried it instead. Now ask yourself, does any of this sound familiar? When symbols outlive their substance, when democracy becomes theater, when the crowd trades civic duty for comfort and spectacle. History doesn't just rhyme, it repeats with a darker chorus. So before we dive into the myths and mirrors of the Roman Empire, I want you to hold one thought in your mind. What if SPQR never really died? What if it simply moved west, traded togas for suits, marble forums for marble floors in DC, and found a new empire to inhabit? Because this isn't just a story about the past, it's a warning from it, one that echoes throughout the entire history of the Roman Empire, and now perhaps through us. The Roman Republic was never meant to fall. It was a vision etched into law and legend of shared power between the Senate and the people. At least that's what the marble inscriptions told you. Senatus Populusque Romanus, SPQR, the Senate and the Roman people, together, forever. But history, like stone, cracks beneath pressure. In the late Republic, the Senate no longer represented the masses, it represented wealth. As landowners and aristocrats gained more power, the average Roman citizen became a spectator in the theater of their own state. The comitia, once a form of citizen voice, turned into a ceremonial echo chamber. Historians still debate whether the Roman Republic ever truly existed in practice, or whether it was an illusion sustained by tradition and ritual. The drift toward oligarchy wasn't marked by war, it came in increments. In the wake of the Punic Wars, vast provinces were conquered, but instead of redistributing spoils, the Senate let elites claim them. Slaves poured into the economy, pushing citizen farmers out. Urban unemployment rose. Bread lines lengthened. The Republic, once defined by civic duty, began catering to desperation. In this growing void, the optimates and popularis conservative elites versus populist reformers battled not for ideas but for control. Sound familiar? In America, the Constitution was meant to be sacred. 3 branches, checks and balances, a voice for the people. But over time, lobbying has replaced listening. Campaigns are financed by corporate giants. Gerrymandering redraws the will of the public. Senators act more like lifetime nobles than public servants. As in Rome, symbols remain intact, but meaning quietly dissolves beneath them. And then there's the strange case of the Lex Hortensia, passed in 287 BCE. It granted resolutions of the plebeian assembly equal weight to Senate decrees. It was hailed as a victory for the commoner, but in practice it only helped consolidate more decisions behind closed doors. It's eerily reminiscent of America's modern executive orders, legal, powerful, and often invisible to those they affect. Rome's illusion of representation endured for centuries until it didn't. But illusions are seductive. They make collapse look like continuity. And behind every illusion, someone benefits. Power hates a vacuum. And in the twilight of the Roman Republic, that vacuum was deafening. The Senate squabbled over trivialities. The people starved in the shadows of temples built in their name. The provinces exploited, yet silence murmured with unrest. And into that silence stepped a man not born of kings, but destined to crown himself in legacy. He was not the first to rise on charm and daring, but he was the first to wield charisma like a blade and turn political theater into a weapon that cracked the spine of a republic. Caesar didn't just lead armies. He led narratives. He fed the masses with grain and entertained them with games. But more than that, he made them feel seen. He gave speeches that stirred identity, offered reforms that promised hope, and created a persona that blurred the line between leader and savior. The Forum became his stage, Rome his audience. And when he crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE, it wasn't just a military move. It was a psychological coup. He didn't just defy geography, he defied centuries of unwritten law. The river sacred and forbidden to armed generals was a line no one crossed, until Caesar. The message was simple: Rome is broken, and only I can fix it. The Senate froze, the people cheered, the Republic flinched. Historians still debate whether Caesar truly intended to destroy the Republic or if he believed he could save it from itself. But as with all strong men, it is not intent that defines them. It is impact. With every reform, every bypass of precedent, the old institutions crumbled further. The Senate, once a council of debate and accountability, became a backdrop to parades. Politics became performance. Law, a tool of perception. And then came the knife. His assassination in 44 BCE, branded as a desperate defense of liberty, only accelerated what it aimed to prevent. The Republic, already bleeding, could not recover. Into that void stepped his adopted heir Octavian. But Octavian didn't rule by brute force. He ruled by artifice. He kept the Senate alive not out of reverence but utility. He called himself Princeps, the first among equals, never king, never tyrant. But make no mistake, his word was law. And Rome, now an empire in all but name, never again tasted true republicanism. Now fast forward 2 millennia. The stage is different. The weapons have changed. But the choreography all too familiar. In modern America, dysfunction is no longer an aberration. It's a feature. Gridlock paralyzes Congress. Trust in institutions has eroded to historic lows. Cynicism is the currency of discourse. And into this dysfunction steps a familiar archetype, the strongman dressed as savior. Not with swords, but with slogans. Not through conquest, but through charisma. Modern populism thrives where systems stall. The more chaotic the machine, the more attractive the outsider who promises to break it. They rally crowds not with complex policy, but with identity grievance and the illusion of restoration. The playbook echoes Caesar offer reforms that bypass tradition, undermine institutions while claiming to defend them. Position yourself not just as an alternative, but as the only alternative. It is not exclusive to one party, not bound by one ideology. It's a rhythm older than flags, older than republics. Even before Caesar Tiberius Gracchus tested these waters, a tribune of the plebs, he proposed radical land reforms to restore dignity to dispossessed Roman citizens. When the Senate resisted, he went directly to the people, shattering sacred precedent. The result: riots, division, his assassination on the Senate floor. It was the first political murder in the Republic, a tremor before the quake. What followed in Rome were decades of civil wars, political purges, and the slow erosion of civic faith. Because democracy does not vanish overnight. It erodes, quietly, systematically. And most chilling of all, it often begins not with tyranny, but applause. Because people exhausted by complexity begin to crave simplicity. They no longer want debate, they want resolution. They trade nuance for certainty, law for loyalty, balance for belief. And in that moment of trade, democracy dims. The rise of the strongman is not an accident. It is a symptom, a signal, that a society has lost faith in its own design. Rome learned this too late, and so the Republic became a memory preserved in marble but erased in meaning. The question now is not whether America is Caesar's Rome. The question is whether anyone can see the Rubicon before it is crossed again. The Colosseum roared louder than the Senate ever could. By the time of Emperor Titus, the Roman people no longer sought virtue, they sought distraction. Gladiators, chariot races, exotic beasts torn apart for spectacle. Rome's greatness was not measured in laws passed or battles won, but in the size of its crowds, and how long they cheered. Panem et circenses. Bread and circuses. That's what the poet Juvenal called it, a cynical bribe of food and entertainment to pacify the masses. And it worked. The empire gave the people what they craved, not what they needed. Citizenship was hollowed out. Responsibility faded. Rome became a theater, and its citizens willing spectators. In modern America, the screens are brighter, but the pattern is hauntingly similar. Sports stadiums draw more attention than civic debates. Celebrities dominate headlines while policy changes slip by unnoticed. TikTok reality shows and culture wars distract a weary public from systemic decline. A consumer society feeds off convenience and outrage, while the pillars of civic engagement quietly wither. Historians still debate whether Rome fell from within or was pushed from without. But many agree that moral decline, cultural, spiritual, civic, played a decisive role. Not in a puritanical sense, but in the abandonment of shared responsibility. Romans no longer saw themselves as stewards of the Republic, but as spectators of empire. There's a peculiar historical footnote here. Emperor Elagabalus, who ruled briefly in the 3rd century, once drowned guests in rose petals during a banquet. It was an absurd, grotesque symbol of indulgence beauty turned into suffocation. So too today, beauty and excess can cloak decay. Influencer lifestyles, luxury branding, viral controversies, they dazzle but rarely nourish. America, like Rome, increasingly mistakes comfort for strength. Even education, once a civic virtue in Rome's early years, becomes transactional. Philosophy gives way to entertainment. Dialogue is drowned in algorithmic noise. Politics is reduced to branding wars. The Republic becomes reality TV. And as citizens grow addicted to drama, they forget the discipline of democracy. They stop asking questions. They stop demanding accountability. They scroll. When Rome fell, few heard the crash. The amphitheaters were still full. The game still ran. The empire didn't collapse like a wall, it crumbled like sand. Grain by grain, applause by applause. And it left behind silence, louder than the roar that came before. Rome did not conquer to protect itself. It conquered because it forgot how not to. What began as a city defending its walls became an empire chasing its own shadow. From Carthage to Gaul, from Egypt to Britannia, Rome's borders kept expanding not for safety, but for glory, for tribute, for distraction. Each new campaign promised security. Each fresh province was declared essential. But with every victory, instability followed. The legions marched not to protect, but to postpone. To delay the reckoning that always comes when an empire grows faster than it can govern. By the 3rd century CE, Rome's territory stretched across 3 continents. But its heart, it was fractured, thin, exhausted. Historians still debate whether Rome's imperialism was reactive or proactive. Was it pushed by external threats or pulled by internal hunger for conquest? But one truth remains clear. The farther the frontiers reached, the more fragile the core became. War became a habit, not an emergency, a default setting for diplomacy. A ritual. Every campaign drained the treasury. Soldiers demanded land as payment. Veterans returned home expecting pensions, spoils, and status, but often found debt, political neglect, and bureaucratic delays. To pay for war, Rome increased taxation on its provinces. And when that wasn't enough, it devalued its currency. Silver coins were mixed with cheaper metals, prices rose, trust collapsed. Meanwhile, a tidal wave of enslaved peoples flooded the economy, lowering labor costs but decimating the rural working class. Local farmers couldn't compete. Small landowners sold their plots. Land concentrated into the hands of elites. And citizenship, once a duty, became a debt. And still the empire marched on. Now look to the modern map. The United States too maintains a vast global footprint. Over 750 military bases across more than 80 countries. Ongoing operations, alliances, and advisory missions from the South China Sea to the Middle East. Each intervention justified in the name of security. But the cost, not just in dollars, but in fatigue, in fragmentation, in something harder to measure, cohesion. The strange tale of Marcus Licinius Crassus deserves mention. A wealthy Roman senator obsessed with prestige, he launched an unauthorized campaign in 53 BCE against the Parthian Empire. He sought glory in the East Land gold legacy, but instead his army was annihilated at the Battle of Carrhae. Crassus was captured. According to legend, molten gold was poured into his mouth, a brutal mockery of his greed. It was one of Rome's greatest humiliations. But did Rome learn none? Because imperial appetite doesn't learn? It hungers, it consumes, and it disguises itself as virtue. In the United States today, defense spending exceeds the next 10 nations combined, and yet veterans often face underfunded healthcare, long waiting lists, and rising homelessness. Civilians argue over wars long after they've ended, if they ever do. We praise our soldiers, but rarely ask what we're asking them to defend. And what about the homeland? Education budgets shrink. Bridges rust, cities flood, healthcare breaks families, and the next generation, raised under the constant hum of conflict, carries trauma without memory of peace. Public trust fractured. Citizens grow cynical not just about politicians, but about the very concept of truth, of justice, of shared meaning. National identity splinters between pride and disillusionment, because endless war has a cost beyond the battlefield. It bleeds into the soul of a people. Rome learned that truth too late, that conquest without cohesion is not strength, it's rot dressed as glory. It's easy to admire the marble, to cheer the legions, to salute the eagle. But inside the temples, the cracks had already begun. And so too today, America risks forgetting security is not something you conquer. It is something you build. Not with bombs, not with surveillance, but with trust, with justice, with care for the citizen and the soil they stand on. There was a moment in Roman history, a quiet one, when an emperor tried to remember this. Hadrian. Unlike his predecessors, he chose not to expand Rome's borders. Instead, he built walls. Most famously in Britannia, Hadrian's Wall, a symbolic line not of conquest but of consolidation. He fortified borders, he invested in infrastructure, he visited provinces, he sought to make the empire sustainable, not glorious. But it was too little, too late. The empire had grown addicted to war, to motion, to size, to spectacle. The eagle's wings had grown too wide and too weary to fold. By the 4th century, Rome was no longer one city. It was two empires, east and west, fractured by size, by language, by culture, and by something deeper: fatigue. The Western Empire staggered under its own contradictions. Bureaucracy ballooned to suffocating levels. The tax code became so complex that even tax collectors abandoned their posts. Currency debased. Gold was hoarded. Silver was diluted. Prices soared, wages crumbled, and trade routes became haunted by instability. Borders blurred. Barbarians were no longer foreigners at the gates, they were soldiers in the ranks. Mercenaries filled the legions once defended by proud Roman citizens. Loyalty, once sacred, became transactional. Emperors came and went, like shadows cast against firelight, some ruling for only months before being assassinated, deposed, or forgotten. The throne became a roulette wheel of intrigue, bribes, and betrayal. But beneath it all, the most dangerous erosion wasn't economic or military. It was spiritual. Not of religion, but of belief in the system itself. People stopped believing in Rome. They still paid taxes, still cheered the parades, still bowed to imperial titles. But in the corners of the empire, in the alleyways of Carthage, the ports of Antioch, the forests of Gaul, allegiance thinned. Rome no longer meant identity. It meant obligation. Citizenship, once a badge of pride, became a burden. Laws were issued but not obeyed. Corruption became the air everyone breathed and no one questioned. Identity shifted from civic to tribal, from empire to enclave, from nation to survival. Power still flowed from palaces and forums, but the roots were dry and everyone knew it. Now turn your gaze westward, 20 centuries ahead. The United States, too, faces a strange dissonance. On the surface, everything still works. Elections still happen. Laws are still passed. The courts convene. The Constitution still hangs on classroom walls. But beneath that surface, the soil is shifting. Trust, the lifeblood of a republic, has become brittle. Polls show historic lows in faith toward Congress, media, and even democracy itself. Institutions once seen as guardians of public good are now viewed through lenses of suspicion, tribalism, and despair. Polarization is no longer a political divide. It's an existential fracture. Red and blue are not just parties. They are opposing realities fueled by different facts, different fears, and increasingly different futures. And when a people no longer believe in shared reality, they stop believing in shared government. Historians still debate whether Rome could have been saved. Some argue a stronger currency, a better tax policy, or a more stable bureaucracy might have bought time. But most agree on one thing: when public faith collapses, systems follow. There's a strange, haunting footnote from late Roman history. In 410 CE, when news reached Emperor Honorius that Rome had fallen, he was devastated not because the city was lost, but because he thought they were talking about his pet chicken named Roma. He wept for a bird. It was only later he realized it was the empire that had died. Absurd, yes, but revealing. A ruler mourning a chicken while barbarians breach the gates is not just a joke. It is a metaphor for what happens when leadership becomes ceremonial, detached, performative, obsessed with optics over outcomes. And today, American politics can sometimes feel the same. Debates that once shaped the soul of the nation are now theater for social media. Sound bites replace substance. Senators go viral, but the bridges still crumble. The storms still come, the problems still multiply, and like late Rome, solutions are sought in spectacle. Blame the outsider, silence the dissenter, promise purity, stir outrage, all while the republic rots quietly beneath the marble. Meanwhile, the real empire, the people, is tired. Tired of systems that speak in circles, tired of promises unkept, tired of carrying a weight that only grows heavier. The American dream once offered something transcendent: upward mobility, civic pride, shared meaning, a belief that effort mattered, that freedom was earned and nurtured, not just inherited. But today that dream feels fragile. Wages stagnate while prices soar. Healthcare bankrupts the sick, housing slips out of reach, and the young, burdened with debt, anxious about the future, are left wondering, was it ever real? So what remains? A system that eats itself. Empires do not end with explosions. They end with sighs, a flickering torch, a law not enforced, a silence in the forum where voices once clashed and ideas once mattered. Rome did not realize it was falling while it fell. Its citizens still shopped, worshipped, laughed. The baths were still warm. The aqueducts still ran. The empire still looked like an empire until it didn't. And perhaps that is the most haunting lesson for us today. Because America too still stands. Its skyline gleams. Its anthem echoes. Its symbols endure. But symbols are not enough. Not if they float above a hollowing foundation. Not if justice is recited more than it is lived. Not if freedom becomes a slogan instead of a shared responsibility. The parallels are not perfect, but they don't have to be. History is not a mirror, it's a whisper, and that whisper is growing louder. No system, however mighty, is immune to decay when spectacle replaces substance, when loyalty to power outweighs loyalty to principle, when people forget they were meant to be citizens, not spectators. Yet even in the slow unraveling, there is a space, a stillness, a breath, a moment where choice still exists. To look honestly at the cracks, to remember that republics are not born from marble or myth, but from courage, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of people who refuse to look away. SPQR faded not in fire, but in forgetting. As we trace the entire history of the Roman Empire, we see this pattern not as prophecy, but as possibility. And so we ask, not is America the next Rome? We ask, will anyone hear the echo this time? Because sometimes, in the ashes of empires, a new voice rises, not louder, but truer, not proud, but awake. And if enough hearts choose to listen, then maybe, just maybe, the fall was never the end, but the beginning of remembering what we were always meant to become.